I guess I'm here as a representative of the dismal science, and so I'm going to start off by being really dismal by mentioning that this may just be a gigantic waste of time. We may be doing no good here at all this afternoon. And I say that seriously because if you think about what economics teaches you, it teaches you that specialization matters, right? This is Adam Smith's message. Butchers should butcher, bakers should bake, and brewers should brew. And if they want a sandwich and a beer, they can trade. But trading isn't going to make them better at understanding what they are trying to understand. It may make their lives better, but it's not going to make them better butchers or bakers or brewers. And so what I'm wondering is if maybe this is also true in the production of ideas. Maybe what we should be doing is just specializing in what we do. I should think about economics and free markets, and Steve should think about faith. And, you know, if we want to go talk to each other, that's fine, but I'm not going to make him a better theologian, and maybe he's not going to make me a better economist. But I don't think that's true. I think that this dialogue that we're having today is actually really important. I think talking to each other will make us both better off, and here's why I think this. I think that because what we're doing in economics when we think about markets and what he's doing in theology when he thinks about the things he thinks about is essentially we're answering this or looking at the same kinds of questions. What is the essential characteristic of human nature? And what are the conditions that are necessary for human flourishing? Now, we may be asking those questions for slightly different reasons, but we're asking the same question. And if I listen to Steve and Steve listens to me, I think we can both come up with better answers. So let me just drill down for a minute and explain what I mean. So economics is, we claim to be a social science, but societies are just groups of people. To really effectively do economics, I have to know what these people are all about. And if you think about sort of the faith traditions, Abby used that word imago Dei, which I've never known how to pronounce. And I'm a real Catholic, and I should know that. But that phrase, made in the image of God, I think that appears at least 3 times in Genesis. And so, you know, and people argue about what that means. I Googled that Latin phrase, and you get like 4 million hits because no one really understands it. But what it must mean is that God is really connected to us as human beings. God is not some aloof creature, right? It's God cares about us as people. And it's not, I don't mean that God cares about who wins the lottery and who's going to be condemned to being a fan of the Chicago Cubs, but God really cares about us. So what that means is if we want to understand faith, if we want to understand God, we have to understand human beings. And so that seems to me non-controversial. And frankly, I don't quite understand why we don't have more dialogue between the people who do what I do, economics and think about markets and all that, and people like Steve and everyone else here as well. Now, I would like to blame him. Okay, I'd like to blame the faith community, religious leaders, for their failure to understand economics, and I could make that argument, I suppose. But instead, I want to take a minute and think about why it is that we don't communicate very well. What are the obstacles that prevent this dialogue from taking place? So let me start by telling you what I think is the obstacle which is preventing parts of the faith community from really effectively understanding economics. And the best way I can explain this, I'll tell you in fact, I'm going to give this lecture this evening in a macroeconomics class. I talk about long-run economic growth, and I've got this slide that I show. And on the slide, there's 2 pictures, and the pictures are about the same. They're drawings, and they show peasants from a long time ago plowing fields with an oxen. And what I tell my students is that those 2 pictures represent the same thing, but they're dated 1,000 years apart, from like 100 CE and the other one's from 1100 CE. And the reason that picture is important is that picture shows you that for most of human history, nothing ever changed, right? If you were a Christian in 32 CE or a Christian in 1492, you used the same tools, you ate the same kind of food, you died of the same diseases. There was never any such thing as economic progress. And then somehow beginning right around 1600, things began to get better. And it didn't happen quickly. Took 300 years for the income of England to double from 1500 to 1800. But then for the next 100 years, it doubled again. And then the really remarkable thing is in our lifetimes. So the per capita income of people in Great Britain has quadrupled between 1950 and now. Even more importantly, there's been it's spread all over the world, right? There's like 500 million people that, according to the World Bank, have been lifted out of what they call extreme poverty, and these are people in China, into not a lifestyle that we would recognize as middle class, but a much, much better lifestyle. That's a remarkable achievement. And to be blunt, the religious community just doesn't seem to get this. So let me just quote this infamous quote from Pope Francis in 2013 when he wrote in this apostolic exhortation, Gaudium, Evangelii Gaudium. So here's the quote. He says, "Some people continue to defend trickle-down theories, which assume that economic growth encouraged by a free market will inevitably succeed in bringing about greater justice and greater inclusiveness. This opinion, which has never been confirmed by the facts, expresses a crude and naive trust in the goodness of those wielding economic power." Just think about that quote. Right? Just think about, first of all, forget the rhetoric, this trickle-down economics. That's not a real term that economists or anyone else uses. That's a cable TV term. But never mind. Just think about what he's saying, that, where's my quote? All those people, that there's never been no evidence, this never been confirmed by the facts, and the excluded are still waiting. Well, there's 500 million people in China that are no longer excluded. Their lives aren't great. There's still injustice, and poverty in the world. But in fact, we actually know how to lift people out of poverty. And how we lift people out of poverty is to embed them in an economy that can grow. And the way we embed them in an economy that can grow is to give them freedom. Now, why don't sort of the religious leaders get that? I think the problem is quite straightforward. I think the problem is that religious institutions, they evolved at a time when there was no growth. So, until 1600, everybody thought about economics the same way. Everybody thought that if you want to make poor people better off, you got to take money from rich people. And again, that's no longer true. What we know now is that if you want to make poor people better off, you embed them in a growing economy, and you embed them in a growing economy by giving them economic freedom. So that's kind of my complaint about religious leaders. Now, I'm glad Pope Francis isn't here. Actually, it'd be kind of cool if he was here, but if he was, he's busy. Yeah, I think. But here's the deal. If he were here, he'd slap me into my place in no time. And I think what he would do before he put me in my place is that he'd pick up his Bible and he'd read from, I think it's Matthew. I wrote it down somewhere. I'm not good about remembering Bible quotes, but the part in Matthew where he says, it's the bit about why do you question the speck in your brother's eye without seeing the beam, and don't look at the beam in your own eye. So I think, in fact, in my world, the world of economics, our sins are much bigger. Our omissions, the things that we forget about, are the things that are much more significant than the fact that the Pope doesn't seem to understand some World Bank statistics. I'm going to run out of time before I run out of things to preach about here, but the problem, I think, with my world, and what I think I can get by really applying or looking at religious traditions and thinking about what they mean for me, is that we really need to restore the humanity to economics. Economics has been, for a long, long time, we've been enamored with our science. I grew up in a generation where we were told that we should view people as rational, maximizing agents, and we built these really cool models which explain behavior. Sort of a younger generation of economics, my colleague Ryan over here, they're really data-driven, right? They think that we can understand economics by understanding facts and figures and statistics. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but what we have lost in economics is our understanding of humanity. And I will tell you in closing that there's two books that you will never read if you got a PhD in economics, and one is Keynes' General Theory, and the other is the Bible. And I'm not trying to make a joke. I think there's a reason why we don't read those two books in graduate school. There probably are some things in Keynes' book that are not consistent with the economics that we call Keynesianism, and that's not important now. But what's important is that there's stuff in the Bible about who people really are and what people really want. And if we're going to do our social science properly, if we're going to be good economists, we have to understand the humanity of the people, and you understand the humanity of the people we're trying to help and explain and analyze. You understand them by treating them as people. Okay, so.